The storm had passed, but what Jonathan Hale found scattered across his ranch made him question reality itself. Two Apache women, giants among their people, lay unconscious near his dying cattle. One stood taller than any man he had ever known, the other nearly as massive, their beadwork glittering with the mark of high-born blood. Jonathan froze on the porch, gripping the post with calloused hands. The dawn light stretched over a landscape beaten raw, fences splintered, the earth turned to mud, and a few broken cattle staggered in the pasture. He had seen storms like this during the war, cannon fire shredding fields, but never had nature struck his ranch with such cruelty. Yet even that destruction could not compare to the sight before him. The taller woman, her shoulders broader than any settler he had met, lay sprawled like a fallen oak, blood streaking from a wound at her temple. The other clutched her ribs even in unconsciousness, her breathing shallow, wheezing like a bellows near collapse. They were no ordinary women. They were the kind spoken of in whispers along saloon counters and campfires, the legendary warrior daughters of Apache chiefs, trained to fight beside men, yet charged with carrying forward the sacred bloodline. Jonathan's heart thudded like a war drum. Every instinct screamed at him to back away. Helping Apache was the quickest path to the gallows for a man like him. He knew the stories. Settlers hanged in Amarillo for less, accused of siding with the enemy. Out here in the Texas Panhandle, the law was simple. You helped Apache, you died with them. He wiped rain from his brow and tried to steady his breath. His farm, already dying, could not endure another blow. The Homestead Act had promised a future when he claimed these acres in '66, but after years of drought and storms, he had little left besides a collapsing barn, thinning cattle, and a Bible too worn to read without squinting. His wife, Mary, had passed in childbirth a decade ago. His only son never returned from the Civil War. He was alone. Yet as he looked at the taller woman, her dark eyes flickered open just long enough to meet his. For a heartbeat, he expected fury, hatred sharpened by generations of war. Instead, he saw something else. Fear. The same fear he carried in his chest when he watched the storm strip his ranch bare, knowing he could not stop it. She tried to speak, her voice deep but fragile, and managed only a single word in her native tongue before slipping back into darkness. Jonathan staggered back, torn between reason and conscience. He could walk away, let the elements finish what the storm had started. No one would ever know. Perhaps the neighbors would even praise him if they found the bodies, another settler standing firm against Apache incursion. But the weight in his chest told him otherwise. This wasn't about settlers or Indians. It was about two human beings bleeding into his soil, while he stood calculating the cost of his soul. Jonathan turned from the sight, his boots sinking into the mud as he tried to steady himself. The sensible thing, the only safe thing, was to let the storm finish its work. No settler in his right mind would drag two wounded Apache giants into his home. But his eyes kept drifting back, drawn to the younger woman's labored breaths, each one shorter than the last. A memory came unbidden, sharp as a thorn in winter. His sister Lydia, 3 winters gone, shivering in a fever that no doctor could break. He had held her hand through the night, counting every ragged breath until there were no more left to count. He remembered her eyes, pleading, though she never spoke a word. The woman before him now had that same look. Jonathan pressed a hand to his forehead. Lord, why place this on me now? His ranch was already ruined. His debts with the bankman in Amarillo hung like a noose over his door. He had nothing left to give, not to himself, much less to strangers. And yet, he glanced at the beads draped across their clothing. Intricate patterns of turquoise and silver, the kind worth more than his entire spread. High-born women, daughters of chiefs. If settlers found them here, suspicion would fall squarely on him. They wouldn't ask questions. A rope, a branch, and another forgotten grave. That would be his fate. He leaned against the porch post, rain still dripping from its beam. His Bible sat on the windowsill inside, its leather warped, pages yellowed by time. The words of his late wife often returned to him in moments like this. When you can't see the way forward, let the Lord be your lantern. Jonathan whispered the verse almost without thinking, the words rising from memory as if carried by the storm's retreating wind. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Psalm 23:4. His voice caught at the end, but something inside him steadied. These women were not just burdens, not curses sent to finish him. They were lives laid at his doorstep by Providence, demanding he choose whether his faith meant anything at all. Damn it all, Jonathan muttered, pushing away from the porch. He strode into the mud, knees shaking as he crouched beside the younger woman. Her body was impossibly heavy, muscles solid under his trembling arms. He grunted, straining, as her head lolled against his shoulder. Behind him, the taller woman stirred, half-conscious, dragging herself upright. She swayed like a storm-battered tree, but reached for her sister's legs, determined to help. Together, this broken farmer and a towering warrior, they staggered toward the cabin. Every step felt like walking toward a cliff. Inside, the fire was dying low, the cabin too narrow for the giant woman's frame. Jonathan kicked aside a chair, cleared the table, and lowered the wounded sister onto the wood. Blood seeped through the cloth at her ribs, pooling dark on his floor. For a long moment he stood, chest heaving, staring at what he had done. There would be no turning back now. Whether this choice marked him the greatest fool on the frontier or a man of unseen strength, only God and the rising sun would decide. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. Jonathan braced himself, sliding his arms under the unconscious woman's shoulders. Even limp, Tahu weighed more than a steer, her frame all corded muscle beneath torn fabric. His knees buckled as he lifted, breath tearing from his chest. The sheer size of her made him feel like a boy again, hauling sacks of grain too heavy for his back. "Hold!" the taller woman, Nolan, commanded, her voice low but firm. She staggered upright, swaying, blood trickling from the cut above her brow. Despite her own wounds, she gripped her sister's legs with a strength that startled him. Together, they heaved the younger giant toward the cabin. The ground sucked at Jonathan's boots, mud thick as tar after the storm. Each step sank him deeper, as though the earth itself resisted their passage. His breath rasped, shoulders screaming, while the woman beside him bore the weight with grim resolve. He stole a glance upward. Even hunched, she towered over him, her dark eyes fixed not on him, but on her sister's paling face. They reached the porch, but the real trial lay ahead. The cabin doorway, built narrow to hold winter winds at bay, could barely admit an ordinary man, let alone a giant. Jonathan pressed his back to the frame, trying to angle her broad shoulders through without worsening the wound. The effort nearly toppled them. Nalin barked something sharp in Apache, her tone urgent, and shifted her grip. "Sideways," Jonathan muttered, as much to himself as to her. Sweat stung his eyes. Together, they turned the wounded body inch by inch, scraping against the doorframe until finally she slid through. The table had to be cleared in a heartbeat. Jonathan swept a lantern, tin plates, and his only Bible onto the floor. The thud of sacred pages hitting the boards made his chest tighten. But there was no time for reverence. They laid Tahu down. Blood seeped fast between Jonathan's fingers as he pressed a cloth against her ribs. The gash was deep, ugly, and smelled faintly of iron and wet earth. He had seen wounds like this on battlefields, and most of those men hadn't lasted an hour. He swallowed hard. Nolan hovered beside him, her huge hands surprisingly careful as she steadied her sister's head. She spoke a word he didn't understand, then another, sharper. Her gaze shifted to him, demanding action he wasn't sure he could give. "I'll try," he muttered, reaching for a rag already stained from the storm.
His hand shook, not only from exhaustion, but from the weight of what he was doing. Helping them meant signing his death warrant, yet leaving them meant watching life bleed out on his floor. The fire in the hearth sputtered, shadows lengthening along the log walls. Jonathan felt the press of time like a blade at his neck.
Each shallow breath from Tahu was a drumbeat counting down to silence. He knew what it meant when the breath grew rattled, the chest struggled for air. He had seen it too many times to mistake it. For a moment, the cabin seemed to hold its breath as well. Outside, wind rattled the shutters, but inside, only the faint wheeze of the dying woman filled the room. Jonathan looked at Naylan. She met his gaze without pleading, only the steel of expectation. "We'll keep her alive," he said, though his voice carried more hope than certainty. But deep inside, Jonathan knew the night had only begun, and already the weight of his choice pressed heavier than the woman on his shoulders. Jonathan pressed harder against the wound, his palms aching from the effort. Blood seeped through every scrap of cloth he tried, turning the wood beneath Tahu a dark, glistening red. He glanced at the taller woman. Naylan's jaw was tight, her expression carved from stone, but her hands trembled as she brushed damp hair from her sister's brow. "She won't last the night like this," Jonathan muttered. Naylan's eyes flicked toward him. For a long moment she said nothing, as if weighing whether he deserved the truth. Then, in broken English, her deep voice carried the weight of command. "She hunted," she said, "not for war, for pride of man, chief's son." Jonathan frowned. "Chief's son? You mean your father's heir?" Her gaze hardened. "Chayton. He say Tahu must marry. She say no. He take that as insult. He, dangerous man." She searched for the word, then spat it out with disgust. "Cruel." Jonathan sat back, bloodied rag in hand. He had heard whispers about Apache politics, about alliances formed and broken by marriages, but hearing it like this, through the cracked voice of a wounded sister, made it far too human. "She refused him," Jonathan repeated softly, "and now she's marked for death?" Naylan gave a single nod. "Refusal is shame. Shame on son, shame on clan. He send men after us. They not stop until she gone, or she bend." Her lips curled. "But Tahu not bend. Better die than be beaten wife." The words cut deeper than Jonathan expected. He stared down at the younger woman, her breath rattling, face pale against the flickering lamplight. He thought of Mary, his wife who had followed him into marriage just before the war, only to be left with loneliness when he marched away. She had endured hunger, sickness, and loss while he fought in mud-soaked fields. By the time he returned, she was frail, her laughter dimmed to an echo. She had died bringing their child into a world too harsh to hold him. Jonathan clenched his jaw, the rag twisting in his fists. He knew what it meant for a woman to suffer at the mercy of a cruel man. He had seen soldiers use war as excuse for cruelty, and he had seen the price women paid for it. He looked up at Naylan again. She was right to refuse him. Something shifted in her gaze then, not softness, not gratitude, but recognition, as if she understood that beneath Jonathan's weathered skin and haunted eyes he carried wounds of his own. A groan escaped Tahu's lips, weak but clear enough to draw them both closer. She stirred, eyes fluttering open for a heartbeat before closing again. Naylan bent low, murmuring words in Apache, smoothing her sister's hair. Jonathan exhaled, forcing his shaking hands to steady. "If Chayton's men are hunting you, they'll come here, sooner than we'd like." Naylan's lips pressed into a hard line. "Yes, they come. And when they come, they see white man help us." The truth of it sank into Jonathan like a stone. He had stepped into a storm far greater than the one that tore his fences. Outside, the night deepened, and every gust of wind seemed to carry the promise of riders drawing near. Inside the cabin, 3 lives now beat to the same fragile rhythm. One wounded woman's breath, rattling against the silence, holding them all hostage to the coming dawn. The fire hissed as Jonathan fed it a stick of damp wood. Smoke curled through the cabin, stinging his eyes. Tahu lay still on the table, her breath shallow but steady, while Nalan kept watch like a sentinel carved from stone. Hours passed in uneasy silence until, at last, Nalan spoke. Her English was halting, but her words were sharp. "You," she said, her gaze narrowing on him, "I know you." Jonathan blinked, confused. "Know me? We've never met." Her eyes didn't waver. "River, 3 moons past. Girl, near death. You." The memory came rushing back, unbidden. He had been checking his traps along the creek after a rare rain. The water ran higher than usual, swollen with debris. There he'd found a girl, barely 14, tangled in branches, half drowned and burning with fever. He remembered kneeling in the mud, hands trembling as he cut her free. The girl's lips were blue, her pulse faint. He had stayed with her through the night, feeding her scraps from his own pack, praying she'd live long enough to walk. At dawn, when she could stand, he pointed her south toward the hills where Apache land began. Then he had walked away, never expecting to see her again. Jonathan rubbed his palms against his thighs, the memory as vivid as the smoke in his eyes. "That girl, she was your kin?" Nalan's face softened, though only for an instant. "Youngest daughter of Dasota High, chief, my sister. You saved her life. This is truth." Jonathan sat heavily on the stool, the weight of her words pressing down like a millstone. "I didn't even give her my name." "She told father of white man," Nalan said firmly. "White man with steady hands who fight river spirits and not leave her to die. Father swore blood debt, life for life." Jonathan stared into the fire. He had heard whispers of Apache blood debts, sacred vows that bound families for generations. It was not a gift, it was a chain, forged in honor and obligation. And now it had found him. "I never wanted thanks," he murmured. "I only did what was right." Nalan's gaze sharpened. "Then you understand. Tonight, same choice. You help again, though it bring death to you. That is why I know River Girl spoke true." Jonathan felt his throat tighten. What had seemed like an isolated act of mercy months ago had returned to claim him. He thought he had left the girl to her people, left the burden behind. But the frontier had long memory, and now that single choice had tangled his fate with theirs. Tahu stirred, whispering weakly in Apache. Nalan bent low, listening, then straightened with eyes darker than the storm outside. "She says men still hunt us. She says if they find us here, they will not spare you." Jonathan rose, pacing the cabin. His boots creaked against the boards, each step echoing louder than he intended. He looked at the 2 sisters, giants of legend, yet so vulnerable on his floor, and felt the noose tightening around his neck. The storm outside had passed, but another had risen in its place, one woven not of wind and rain, but of blood, honor, and debts he never asked to claim. By the time dusk settled over the plains, the cabin had become a cage of silence. Shadows stretched long across the dirt floor, and the fire sputtered low. Jonathan sat with his rifle across his knees, though he doubted 12 cartridges could save them from what lurked beyond the horizon. Tahu's breathing had steadied slightly, but every rasp reminded him how close she balanced on the edge. Nalan crouched by the window, eyes fixed on the southern ridge. She had hardly moved in an hour, a statue carved of bone and sinew, listening for sounds Jonathan couldn't hear. Then, faint but undeniable, the wind carried the drumming of hooves. Jonathan's stomach tightened. He crossed the room and peered through a narrow crack in the shutter. 5 riders crested the ridge, their silhouettes stark against the fading light. They sat their horses with the patience of hunters, scanning the valley below.
Even from a distance, Jonathan could see the streaks of paint across their faces, the glint of rifles slung across their backs.
"They've found us," he whispered. Nolan didn't flinch. "They follow blood. They follow shame. They come for her." She glanced at her sister, then back at him. "And for you." Jonathan felt the weight of the words. His neighbors would see only a white man consorting with Apache royalty, enough to hang him without trial. To the warriors outside, he was either an enemy harboring fugitives or an ally daring to invoke their law. The hoofbeats slowed, and the riders fanned out like wolves circling prey. One raised his hand, pointing directly at the cabin. Jonathan's palms were slick against the rifle stock. He thought of Mary, of the graves he had already dug, and of the verse that had steadied him hours earlier. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." He swallowed hard. Nolan's voice broke the silence. "What you do next," she said, her tone steady, "decides if you live as friend or die as enemy." Jonathan's throat was dry. He had one choice: to speak truth. Months ago, he had saved a half-drowned girl and walked away, thinking no more of it. But her name, her blood, her father's oath had followed him across the plains and into this night. He stepped to the door, heart hammering, and called out in a voice louder than he expected. "My name is Jonathan Hale. 3 moons ago, I found a girl by the river. I freed her from the branches, gave her food, and led her home. She was the daughter of Chief DeSoto High." The night stilled. Even the horses outside seemed to freeze. A voice answered in Apache, harsh and demanding. Another followed, younger, sharper. Nalin translated under her breath. "They say, prove it. They say, Chief will judge." Jonathan's grip tightened on the rifle. "When?" Nalin's gaze held his, steady as stone. "At dawn." The words hung in the cabin like a death sentence waiting for sunrise. The cabin had barely settled into uneasy silence when another sound broke through the night. The jangle of spurs, the creak of leather, the unmistakable stomp of disciplined horses. Jonathan's blood went cold. This was no raiding party. These were lawmen. Nalin stiffened at the window, her massive frame tensing like a bowstring. Jonathan eased beside her, peering through the narrow slit. 3 riders advanced from the north, their silhouettes sharper, their posture rigid. Lantern light glinted off polished revolvers and brass badges, federal marshals. The lead rider swung down from his horse, boots crunching against the gravel. Jonathan recognized him instantly, Deputy Marshal Carter Kane, a man with eyes as hard as rifle barrels. Kane's voice carried across the yard, sharp as a whip. "Jonathan Hale, we know you're in there. Come out slow, hands high." Jonathan's grip on the rifle tightened, out of the frying pan and into the fire. If the marshals found Nalin and Tahu here, there would be no trial, no plea. The Morrison Ranch had been attacked last week, leaving settlers dead. Fear and fury swept the territory like wildfire, and Kane had been sent to stamp it out. Any Apache found would be shot on sight. He looked at Nalin, her jaw set like stone, but her hand rested lightly on her knife. Tahu stirred faintly on the table, her breathing ragged. They had no chance of fighting their way free. Jonathan stepped to the door, forcing calm into his voice. "Evening, Marshal." Kane's gaze flicked past him to the cabin. "Tracking party followed blood this way. You've got hostiles inside." Jonathan swallowed. "I've got injured folks here, that's all." Kane's eyes narrowed. "Injured Apache women by the look of those prints outside?" He gestured toward the mud where giant footprints stamped clear as day. "You hiding killers, Hale?" Jonathan's heart thudded, but he drew himself taller. "I'm helping 2 human beings bleeding out in my yard, same as I would for any man, woman, or child." Kane sneered. "Apache aren't people to the law. They're hostiles. Harboring them makes you no different from them. You'll hang for this."
The words should have broken him. Instead, something steadier rose in Jonathan's chest, born of the verse etched into his memory since boyhood. His voice carried stronger than he felt. Scripture says, "Love your neighbor as yourself." That's what I did, Marshal. No law of man will tell me mercy is a crime. Cain's lip curled. Mercy? Tell that to the Morrison family buried on their land. He stepped closer, hand brushing the butt of his Colt. Step aside, Hale. We'll see for ourselves what you're hiding. Behind him, his deputies spread out, rifles at the ready. Inside the cabin, Nayland shifted, her towering frame blocking the table from sight.
Her presence filled the room with silent defiance. Jonathan felt her gaze on his back, trusting him to hold the line. The night had grown more dangerous than he could have imagined. On one side, Apache warriors waiting for dawn. On the other, the full weight of federal law. And Jonathan Hale stood squarely between them, armed with nothing but a battered rifle and his faith. Cain's hand hovered over the door latch when the cabin creaked behind Jonathan. Heavy footsteps shook the floorboards. He turned just in time to see Nalin rise to her full, towering height, her shadow spilling across the lamplight. Before Jonathan could stop her, she stepped past him and pushed the door wide. The marshals froze. Even hardened lawmen who'd seen Comanche raids and border skirmishes gaped at the sight of her. 7 feet of muscle and sinew, dressed in torn beadwork glittering faintly with silver. Her dark eyes steady and unyielding. "I am Nalin," she declared, in English rough but commanding. Her voice carried across the yard, low and deep, as though the earth itself spoke through her. "Daughter of Chief DeSotohay, my sister lies wounded. This man saved her life." Cain blinked, jaw tightening.
You expect me to believe that? Behind her, Tahu staggered into the doorway, leaning on the frame, pale but upright. Even weakened, she cut a figure as formidable as any soldier. "We are daughters of the chief," she said, her accent thicker but her meaning clear. "Our blood is royal, and Apache law protects those who show mercy to us." Cain barked a laugh, but it was thin, forced. "Apache law don't mean a damn thing to federal authority." Jonathan stepped forward, heart pounding. "That's not true, Cain. You know the treaty. Medicine Lodge, 1867. Federal government recognized Apache law in tribal matters. You break that, you're the one who answers to Washington." Cain's face blanched. He knew the treaty. Every marshal did. It had been hammered out to keep peace after years of bloodshed. No one liked it, but it was binding. One of the deputies shifted uneasily, glancing at the ground. Another muttered, "She's telling the truth, Cain. Look at the beadwork. That's Chief's family." Nalin raised her chin, gaze never leaving Cain. "You touch him," she said, pointing at Jonathan with a hand scarred from battle. "You break oath between nations. My father will come at dawn. He will decide with your law and ours." The silence stretched taut as wire. Cain's pistol hand twitched once, then dropped to his side. His jaw worked, chewing on the taste of defeat. "Fine," he spat. "We'll wait. But hear me, Hale. If your chief doesn't show, or if his judgment doesn't satisfy federal law, I'll drag all 3 of you back in irons. Blood debt, treaties, none of it will save you then." He motioned to his men. The deputies spread into the shadows, setting a loose perimeter around the ranch. Cain lingered a moment longer, eyes locked with Jonathan's. There was no respect in that stare, only promise of reckoning. When he finally turned away, the yard fell into uneasy quiet. The marshals melted into the night, but Jonathan knew they were still there, rifles ready, watching every flicker of lamplight through his shutters. Inside the cabin, the fire burned low. Jonathan sank into his chair, exhaustion pressing down like stone. Nalin crouched by her sister again, murmuring in Apache, while outside, both marshals and warriors waited for dawn. The cabin had become a crucible, caught between 2 laws, two worlds.
And Jonathan Hale sat in the middle, with only faith and fragile hope to carry him through the longest night of his life. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The first light of dawn crept across the plains, washing the valley in a pale glow. Jonathan stood in his doorway, his body rigid from a sleepless night. His rifle rested in his hands, though he knew it would do little now. On one side, the marshals still ringed his property, their silhouettes dark against the fading stars. On the other, somewhere beyond the ridge, Apache riders would soon appear. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. A low murmur rippled through the marshal's line as dust rose from the northern horizon. Jonathan squinted. A small procession approached, not a war party, but a deliberate, solemn group. At its head rode Chief DeSoto Hay, his bearing as unshakable as the mountains. 5 elders rode behind him, faces painted in ceremonial lines, their movements slow, measured, almost ritual. Kane stepped forward from behind his barricade, his badge catching the morning light. His hand rested on his revolver, but his posture was sharp with authority. "That better be your chief," he barked toward Nolan, "because if it's not, we'll settle this in blood." Nolan rose to her full height beside Jonathan. The early sun glinted off the silver woven into her beadwork, turning her into a figure both fierce and regal. "It is my father," she answered simply, her voice carrying clear across the yard. Jonathan's heart pounded as the riders drew close. When the chief dismounted, every gesture radiated control. He was older than Jonathan had expected, gray threading his hair, deep lines cut into his face. But his presence silenced the marshals. He carried himself like a man who commanded not only warriors, but the very air around him. Chief DeSoto Hay's gaze swept the yard, pausing on Jonathan, then on his daughters. Finally, he fixed his eyes on Kane. "Marshal," he said, his English precise, almost formal, "you hold my daughters under threat. This is not the way of peace between our peoples." Kane stepped forward, his boots grinding against the gravel. "Your daughters murdered settlers at the Morrison place. They're wanted under federal law. Hiding them makes this man," he jabbed a finger toward Jonathan, "an accomplice." Jonathan's throat tightened. The words echoed across the yard, final and damning. This was it, the point of no return. Whatever happened next, there was no going back to quiet days of fixing fences and tending cattle. He was entangled in blood, law, and judgment far beyond himself. The chief's face did not change, but his voice hardened. "My daughters defended their honor. Morrison forced himself upon them. Apache law justifies their actions, and your own treaty recognizes Apache law." Kane's jaw clenched. He shot a glare at Jonathan, then back at the chief. "Federal law doesn't bend to tribal customs." The yard crackled with tension. Marshals shifted their rifles. The Apache elders exchanged low words in their tongue. Jonathan stood caught between them all, his palms damp against the rifle stock. This was no longer about survival. It was about truth, law, and honor colliding in the first light of day. And Jonathan Hale knew that whatever judgment was passed here would reshape the rest of his life. Kane's boots crunched as he advanced into the open, shoulders squared, voice sharp enough to slice the morning air. "Federal law governs this land," he declared, his hand resting near the revolver at his side. "These women may be your daughters, Chief, but they stand accused of murder, and harboring them," his glare snapped to Jonathan, "is treason against the United States." Chief DeSoto Hay did not move. His eyes, dark and steady, regarded Kane as though measuring a boy who had raised his voice too loud at council fire. "Murder?" the chief repeated, his tone calm but cutting. "You speak as though settlers never wronged Apache. Morrison forced himself upon my daughters. They defended their honor. Apache law calls that justice. Your treaty calls it recognized." A murmur rippled among the elders at his back. Their painted faces betrayed no fear, only solemn approval. Kane's jaw flexed. Treaties bend to federal courts. A woman's word, Apache or not, won't outweigh the bodies in Morrison's field. Washington will demand blood. Jonathan shifted uneasily, sweat prickling his neck. He knew enough of frontier justice to understand Kane wasn't bluffing. Settlers buried their dead with rifles in hand, crying out for vengeance. Any excuse to hang an Apache or the man who helped them would be seized. Dasadahe's voice grew harder, though never raised. And yet, Washington signed Medicine Lodge, promised our customs respected when our people judged our own. Your badge, his gaze flicked to the sunlit star pinned to Kane's chest, cannot erase your own government's word. Kane barked a laugh, but there was no mirth in it. You think Washington cares what your council says? Federal law is written in iron and lead. You resist, and we'll see how quickly your customs burn. The words rang like a spark near dry grass. Marshall shifted, fingers brushing triggers. Jonathan's stomach knotted. The air itself seemed to lean toward violence. It was then he felt Nolan's eyes on him, steady and unyielding. Her gaze cut through the chaos like a blade. Speak. Jonathan's chest tightened. Every instinct screamed to stay silent, to keep his head down. But he remembered the girl by the river, her fevered skin, her fragile breath, and the oath unspoken in that moment. To help, without thought of cost. He stepped forward, voice hoarse but carrying. Chief Dasodahai speaks truth. 3 moons ago, I found your youngest daughter by the river. She was half drowned, dying. I freed her, fed her, and sent her home. She lived. Her words were no lie. The yard fell silent. Even the horses stilled. Kane's eyes snapped to him, blazing. You admit it? You admit to aiding Apache? Jonathan held his ground. I admit to saving a life, same as I did last night. The admission hung in the dawn like a hammer about to fall. The die was cast. Jonathan Hale could never return to the man he was before. The silence that followed Jonathan's confession was heavier than any gunshot. The elders murmured among themselves, their words a low rumble in the Apache tongue. Nolan stood tall beside him, her chin lifted as though she had expected this moment all along. Tahu, pale but unbroken, leaned against the cabin post, her breath ragged but eyes sharp. Chief Dasodahai stepped forward, his shadow long in the rising sun. He studied Jonathan with a gaze so steady it felt like judgment itself. 3 daughters, he said slowly, his voice carrying across the yard. Not 1, not 2, but 3 you saved. Jonathan's brow furrowed. 3? The chief's hand rose, pointing toward Nayland and Tahu. Last night you saved these 2, when you might have left them to die. Then his finger shifted, pressing the air like a brand. And months passed, by the river, you saved my youngest, River Girl. 3 lives owed to you, blood debt beyond question. The words struck Jonathan like a hammer. His knees weakened, and he caught himself on the rifle stock. He had expected judgment, perhaps a reprieve, but not this, an honor that felt more like chains. Kane exploded. This is madness! He stormed forward, spittle flying. You can't just rewrite the law because of some tribal superstition. Blood debt means nothing under the United States. Dasodahai's eyes flicked toward him, calm but merciless. It means everything under Apache law, and Washington's signed treaty that your badge swore to honor. Kane's face reddened, fury breaking through the cracks of his composure. His hand twitched toward his revolver, but none of his deputies moved. Their eyes were fixed on the towering sisters, on the chief's unflinching stance, on the weight of the moment that even bullets might not undo. The chief turned back to Jonathan. From a pouch at his side, he drew a necklace of carved bone and hammered silver. Sunlight caught the polished edges, sending shards of light across the yard. It was a piece no man outside the chief's bloodline had ever worn.
He held it high. "Jonathan Hale," he intoned, "by blood debt and by deed, you are no longer stranger. You are son. Apache law binds you to my family." Jonathan's breath caught. Son! The word echoed in his chest, colliding with memories of his own child, lost at birth, a wound that had never healed. Now here he stood, being claimed by a people who had every reason to call him enemy. The chief stepped closer and placed the heavy necklace around Jonathan's neck. The weight of it was more than silver and bone. It was history, obligation, and a new life he had never chosen. Cain's voice cut the air, raw with rage. "This isn't over, Hale. You think that necklace saves you? Federal law will gut you where you stand." Jonathan looked up, the necklace cold against his skin, and met Cain's furious eyes. For the first time in years, he stood taller, not from pride, but from the strange, undeniable truth that his life now belonged to something greater than himself. The necklace still pressed cold against Jonathan's chest when Chief DeSoto High turned to face him once more. The elders had already begun to mount, their painted faces unreadable in the pale morning light. The chief's gaze lingered, steady and calculating. "You have been named son," he said, his voice solemn. "But adoption solves law, not heart. Tomorrow I return with another decision. Be ready." Jonathan opened his mouth, but no words came. He wanted to ask what decision, what judgment, what fate. But the chief had already turned away. With deliberate calm, he mounted his horse, and the procession moved off, vanishing into the horizon's haze. The silence that followed was unbearable. Even the marshals held their tongues. Cain spat into the dirt, muttering curses, but made no move to press further. His men, unsettled by the weight of ceremony they had just witnessed, drifted back into their perimeter, muttering low. Jonathan stood in the yard, staring after the disappearing riders. Another decision? The words circled his mind like vultures. What more could the chief take from him? What more could be asked? Nayland stepped closer, her towering frame casting a shadow over him.
"Father speaks with many layers," she said quietly. "Sometimes his words hide meaning even from daughters." Her presence steadied him more than the rifle in his hands. He nodded, though his stomach churned. "Then tomorrow I'll find out." That night the cabin became a crucible of silence. Outside, marshals lingered with rifles and campfires, their shadows shifting across the yard. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries sharp against the stillness. Inside, the fire burned low, casting soft light across the rough-hewn walls. Tahu dozed fitfully on the table, her wound bandaged but angry, fever rising and falling like the tide. Nalin tended her with hands both gentle and precise, muttering words in Apache that Jonathan could not understand, yet somehow felt were prayers. Jonathan sat opposite, his rifle across his lap, though his eyes were fixed not on the door but on Nalin. The lamplight softened the hard lines of her face, revealing strength forged by battle and loss, but also something quieter, resilience that mirrored his own. Their eyes met once, then again. Neither spoke. Words seemed fragile in the thick night air. Instead, there was only the crack of wood in the hearth, the steady rasp of Tahu's breathing, and the unspoken weight of all that tomorrow might bring. Jonathan thought of Mary, of the nights he had sat awake while she labored through sickness, praying without answer. He thought of his son, lost before his first cry. And he thought of the chief's necklace, heavy against his chest, binding him to a people and a fate he had never imagined. Nalin broke the silence at last. "You are not like other men we meet," she said simply. Her voice was low, almost reluctant. Jonathan swallowed, the words striking deeper than any bullet. "Neither are you," he answered. The fire crackled. Outside, the marshals shifted. And between them, in that fragile stillness, something unspoken rooted itself, dangerous, undeniable, and waiting for the dawn.
The morning broke clear and sharp, the kind of dawn where every sound seemed too loud, every shadow too long. Jonathan stood in the yard, the necklace of carved bones still heavy against his chest. He had not slept. Neither, it seemed, had Nolin. She stood beside him, tall and unyielding, her presence a fortress against the unknown. Dust rose again on the northern horizon. The procession was smaller this time. Chief DeSoto High, the same 5 elders, their horses moving with ceremonial precision. The marshals stirred uneasily, rifles in hand, but Kane barked no orders. His face was taut, his jaw working as though he chewed on his own rage. The chief dismounted with the grace of a man who knew every eye watched him. His elders followed, forming a semicircle in the yard. Jonathan's mouth went dry. The words from yesterday still haunted him. Tomorrow I return with another decision. DeSoto High studied him, then his daughters, before speaking. Adoption solved law, he said, his voice measured, carrying to every ear. But it created problem of heart. I see it, my elders see it, even Kane's men see it. His gaze swept the yard, silencing every whisper. Jonathan felt the blood drain from his face. He wanted to speak, to deny, but the weight of the chief's words froze him. Then Nayland stepped forward. She was towering even beside her father, but in that moment she seemed not warrior nor daughter of a chief, only woman with truth burning inside her.
"Father," she said, her voice deep yet steady, "I choose to speak." DeSoto High inclined his head. "Speak, daughter." Nolin turned, her eyes locking on Jonathan's. He felt the ground tilt beneath him as though the storm had returned. Her words cut through the yard like a blade. "Brother has shown honor, courage, mercy, but my heart sees him not as brother." Her voice caught, but only for a moment. "My heart sees him as man worthy of different bond." The world seemed to stop. The marshals muttered among themselves, one even scoffing aloud. Kane sneered openly, seizing the moment. "There it is," he spat, "your own daughter breaking your so-called law. What now, chief? You bind your people to shame?" But DeSoto High did not flinch. He looked at Nolin, then at Jonathan, whose chest heaved under the weight of the confession. For a fleeting moment, the chief's stern eyes softened, though only slightly. "Apache law respects choice," he said firmly, "even when it tears through bonds made yesterday. But choice has consequences." Jonathan swallowed hard. He had faced rifles, storms, and the noose of Kane's fury.
Yet nothing felt as terrifying as standing before Nolin's gaze, hearing her bare her heart in front of father, tribe, and enemy alike. For the first time, he realized the true meaning of the chief's warning. This was no longer about law or blood debt. It was about a decision that would bind not only his fate, but his heart for all the days to come. The yard fell silent after Nolin's words, silence so deep it pressed against Jonathan's chest like a weight. He could feel every eye on him, elders, marshals, Kane, even the wounded Tahu leaning weakly in the doorway. He wanted to speak, but his voice would not come. It was Tahu who broke the silence. She pushed herself upright, gripping the doorframe for strength. Her face was pale, her wound still raw, but her voice carried with the gravity of stone. "I release him," she said in careful English. "Jonathan Hale is no longer brother. He has earned right to choose his own path." Gasps rippled among the elders. Even the marshals shifted uneasily, realizing the weight of her words. Kane's lip curled, but he said nothing. DeSoto Hay's eyes flicked from his youngest wounded daughter to the towering Nolin, then finally back to Jonathan.
"So be it," the chief said. "Yesterday, law bound you as son. Today, law releases you. But Apache law also gives path. A man who has proven himself worthy may take daughter not as sister, but as wife." The words struck Jonathan like thunder. Marriage, not a legal loophole, not a burden forced upon him, but a bond chosen. His heart pounded as his gaze met Naelin's. For once, her dark eyes held no steel, no command, only quiet hope. Cain stepped forward, spitting venom. "This is a farce. You think Washington will recognize a savage wedding? This man is still guilty of harboring hostiles." But his protest sounded hollow against the chief's authority. DeSoto raised a hand, silencing even Cain. "Treaty says Apache family is honored as citizens under protection. Jonathan Hale is now free man, or husband, by both laws." Jonathan's throat tightened. He thought of Mary, gone too soon. He thought of his child, buried before ever seeing the sun. He thought of every night spent alone with only silence for company. And now, standing in the yard, the weight of the necklace still heavy on his chest, he felt something stir that had been dead for years: hope. His voice was steady when he spoke. "Scripture says, greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends." He looked directly at Naelin, his words carrying beyond her. "I would lay down mine, not because I must, but because I choose." The elders nodded, solemn approval etched into their faces. Naelin's breath caught, her towering frame trembling for the first time. DeSoto placed a hand on Jonathan's shoulder, the gesture both blessing and binding. "Then it is done." Cain's jaw worked, fury barely contained. "This isn't over," he growled. "Federal eyes will come, and when they do, no treaty will save you." Jonathan met his glare, but this time he did not waver. Let them come. The sun climbed higher, spilling gold across the yard. For the first time in years, Jonathan Hale felt not like a man cornered, but a man standing on ground that was truly his. If you like this video, please comment number 9. If you don't like it, please comment number 0. The valley had seen blood and storms, but never a gathering like this. Weeks later, under a sky wide and endless, Jonathan Hale stood before a circle of elders, the necklace of adoption still at his chest, now joined by fresh beadwork woven by Naelin's own hands. The ceremony blended two worlds. The Apache elders painted Jonathan's forehead with ash and ochre, symbols of renewal. A local preacher, summoned by nearby settlers curious and uneasy, opened with prayer from the scriptures. Even Cain, forced to linger at the edge of the crowd by order of the territorial governor, stood grim-faced, unable to stop what law and treaty together now bound. Naelin stepped forward, dressed in ceremonial buckskin embroidered with silver beads that caught the sun. Her height dwarfed every settler present, yet she moved with the grace of one who knew her place in the world and feared nothing. Beside her, Tahu leaned on a carved staff, her recovery slow but steady. Pride shone in her dark eyes as she bore witness. Chief DeSoto raised his hand. "Before Creator, before elders, before law of nations, these two are joined, not as enemies, not as brother and sister, but as man and wife." The preacher's voice followed, firm yet reverent. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Jonathan's throat tightened. He had never imagined standing in such a place, before two worlds that once warred, now united by fragile trust. When Naelin's hand slipped into his, it was not delicate but strong, steady, the hand of a warrior who had chosen him as much as he had chosen her. Applause rose, hesitant at first, then louder, echoing across the plains. Settlers whispered at the sight, uncertain but fascinated. Some muttered of scandal, others of hope. Apache voices sang in their tongue, a melody that carried like wind through canyon walls. Tahu stepped forward, her towering frame casting long shadows, and placed a string of white shells around Jonathan's neck. "Brother no more," she said, with a smile that reached her eyes. "Husband now, family still." Jonathan's vision blurred. For the first time since Mary's passing, since the tiny brave dug with his own hands, he felt the weight of loneliness lift. This union was not only survival, it was redemption. Cain turned away, muttering curses, but his deputies lingered, uneasy. They, too, understood history had shifted that day. No bullet fired, no gallows raised, just a man and woman bound together before heaven and earth. As the sun climbed higher, Jonathan looked into Nolan's eyes. She did not smile, not in the way settlers expected, but there was a fire there, a fierce promise. Together, they would face storms, wars, even Cain's vengeance. But for this moment, beneath the wide sky, there was peace. Autumn settled over the plains, crisp air carrying the scent of mesquite and wood smoke. Where once Jonathan Hale's ranch had sagged toward ruin, now wagons rattled in and out daily. A trading post had risen where cattle once grazed, its log walls sturdy, its shelves stacked with goods from both settler and Apache hands. Settlers came from as far as Amarillo, curious to see the giant sisters whose legend had spread across the territory. They came to trade, too, tools for hides, flour for beadwork, stories for respect. The first exchanges had been wary, but soon even the most reluctant farmers admitted the post was thriving in a way no one expected. Nolan moved among them with quiet authority. She was impossible to ignore, towering above every man in the yard, her deep voice steady, her presence commanding. But what surprised people most was her calm fairness. She could haggle with seasoned traders, yet she never cheated. Her strength was not in intimidation, but in the kind of honesty men learn to trust. Tahu, though still healing, had discovered a gift for words. She sat at the long table most days, mediating disputes between settler and Apache with sharp wit and a disarming laugh. "Better trade than bleed," she would say, and even the most hard-headed rancher could not help but grin. Jonathan often stood back, watching them both. There were moments when the memory of Cain's sneer still haunted him, the promise that federal eyes would one day return. Yet each time he remembered the necklace at his chest, the vow spoken by DeSoto, and the law of God that no badge or bullet could erase. At night, when the wagons had rolled away and only coyotes called across the dark prairie, he would sit by the hearth with Nolan at his side. She rarely spoke of love in words. Hers was a language of action, the way she leaned against him after long days, the way her laughter rumbled low when he fumbled with Apache freezes, the way her hand rested on his arm like an anchor against the storms still to come. One evening, as the firelight danced across her face, Jonathan opened the old Bible that had sat gathering dust for years. The pages fell open to a verse he had read countless times, but never truly lived until now. "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." Romans 8:28. He read the words aloud, his voice rough with emotion. Nalin listened, her dark eyes reflecting the flame. She did not need to understand every word to grasp the meaning. Providence had brought them together, through storm, through blood, through choices that could have ended in death, but instead opened into life. Jonathan closed the book, his hand resting on its cover. "I used to think the storm ruined me," he said quietly. "Now I see it carried me here." Outside, the trading post glowed with lamplight, laughter spilling into the night. Settlers and Apache alike gathered around fires, sharing food, stories, even songs. It was fragile, yes, and tomorrow might bring new trials. But tonight there was harmony. Jonathan rose, stepping to the doorway. The plain stretched wide beneath the stars, endless and untamed. Behind him, Nalin and Tahu laughed together, their voices rich and strong. Before him, the future lay open, not certain, but alive with promise. He touched the necklace at his chest, the symbol of blood debt turned blessing, and whispered a prayer of thanks. The storm had passed, and in its wake, God had given him not only survival, but family, love, and a place in a story far greater than his own. Perhaps, friends, as you listened to Jonathan Hale's journey, you remembered your own storms, the losses carried in silence, the choices that weighed heavier than steel, the small acts of mercy that shaped everything that followed. The frontier was never only about dust, rifles, and cattle. It was about ordinary souls, men and women, facing impossible odds and still finding the courage to love, forgive, and build something that lasted. Stories like Jonathan's remind us that faith, compassion, and steadfast hope shine brightest when the night is darkest. And maybe, in your own life, you've seen how God can turn sorrow into blessing just as He did on that lonely ranch. If you were moved by this tale, stay with us for more true Wild West stories, tales of courage, redemption, and the bonds that endure. Subscribe, share, and walk this trail with us, keeping these memories alive for generations to come.